All right, everybody. Well, we're back with another parent recruiting interview. Today I've got Dustin Guinn, and just a little bit of context. He's got two daughters. Keely is graduating this year. She's a 2020 and going to McNeese State out in Louisiana. And then his other daughter, Lexi, is a 2022, and she is committed to Texas A&M. So Dustin has both his daughters done, which I'm sure he's excited about. And yeah, so we'll get started off just with the first question. If there's one thing in the recruiting process, Dustin, that you could have done without, or you could do without, what would that be? And if it's different for each kid, that's totally fine.
Yeah, and it's not different for each kid. There's a couple of things. As I thought about this question, it was a hard one, because overall, the recruiting process, is an exciting time for the kids, but it's also a challenging time, both, emotionally and from a time management perspective. But one of the things that, as I sat here and thought about, is one of the coaches one time said to me, we know within the first 30 seconds whether the kid is going to be an athletic fit for our program or not. And I thought about that for a minute, and I thought that was great. That was a great comment, and it may have just been an offhanded, off-cuffed comment.
Yeah.
But to me, that meant a lot. And unfortunately, because the recruiting process is such a numbers game, and coaches aren't paid to, cull the numbers that fast, there's a lack of transparency sometimes for these kids and their parents about, one, from a self-identification and understanding of your kid's talent level, but two, sometimes that naive nature of parents, especially early on in the process, that lack of transparency feeds that misunderstanding of where your kid actually fits in the process. So I wish there was a way that you could kind of disseminate information and, from the coaches about how they truly feel about your kids, because, there's a disconnect between the cost and the emotional investment and the missed opportunities, frankly, that some of these kids have because they focus on things they shouldn't be focusing on. And that's not just the kids, that's the parents.
Yeah.
So, and what do I mean by that? Well, what I mean by is if you really knew from the coaches how they felt about your kid early on, just because you get a camp invite, or just because, they reach out because they saw a 15-second clip of game film, how they truly felt about your kid, rather than just, we're going to reach out to everybody on the 14, 15 Royal team or whatever the case may be, and your kid is just one of those 12 kids that we're going to reach out to. Well, then all of a sudden you start focusing on these opportunities that may not be real opportunities, and you just lose time and energy on diverted attention. Because, there's only a finite amount of resources financially, yeah, and there's only a finite amount of time from an energy and a time perspective too. There's finite resources, and you've got to learn how to navigate that.
Yeah. No, it's definitely a hard, I feel like I've seen kind of several parents do that over, just my last 3 years doing this. Have several parents seen, start going through that process, and they're getting interest from this big school, that big school. And that's what, like you said, that's what they focus on. And then, fast forward a year in the recruiting process, and all of a sudden those schools aren't as interested, or they're not interested anymore. And so, no, I understand exactly what you're saying. I think it's hard. I think it's hard to balance that and hard to navigate that, especially as parents and as athletes, right? The big shiny coin says they want you to come to their school, and you're like, well, of course that big shiny coin is way better than the smaller, not as shiny coin. And so it's hard to not get fixated on that. And then when that goes away, it definitely is an emotional impact. And so you know, having some actual real feedback, either from the coaches or, you know, someone in between to help through that, I think is really beneficial. But yeah, no, I think that's a consistent theme in recruiting, especially when kids are getting recruited early on. When they're getting the camp invites and the questionnaires from schools, you know, when they're 8th grade and freshmen and things like that. But when, you know, rubber meets the road, and that's one of the things with the 22 class coming up here on June 15th. Like, I mean, rubber's hitting the road on June 15th, and you're either going to hear from a school or you aren't.
Yeah.
That's a pretty hard way to learn that lesson. You know, if there's not anything, you know, kind of being communicated to you guys.
Yeah.
What was your favorite part of the recruiting process?
You know, I think my favorite part is going to be consistent with probably what you've heard from a lot of the parents is, one, you know, you can never replace those teaching moments, those experiences that you have with your kids and learning to kind of navigate the success of being recruited, as well as the, you know, the disappointment of the failure. You know, I mean, you're not going to, you know, most kids, 99.9% of the kids aren't going to be everybody's first choice. And learning to hear that is a life lesson that, you know, is not always fun, but it's those teachable moments that you have through the recruiting process that I thoroughly enjoyed. And I'll admit that it's funny because one of the things that was, you know, was kind of an annoyance of the recruiting process, but it's also one of the things that I love the most was the camps. So it's fun to spend time with your daughters one-on-one, because likely, unlike tournaments or stuff like that, where sometimes the whole family will go, there's typically only one parent that's going to go to a camp with your kid, and watching that nervousness that you have both as a parent and as the kid, and watching them kind of navigate through those intense environments. You know, it's emotionally challenging and draining. It's physically challenging and draining. But the travel to and from was one of the things that I thoroughly enjoyed. And also I view recruiting as kind of a competitive event. And I love watching my kids compete for things that they want, and you know, going through the preparation of the recruiting was fun for me. And, you know, the fact finding, the understanding about the schools, because when you're talking to 14, 15, 16-year-old kids, they're likely not going to know anything about the school. And that goes the same whether you're talking about Texas A&M or McNeese or any of the other 300 schools that are out there. The likely scenario is that your kids aren't going to know anything about the program. Maybe they know who the coach is, but they're more than likely not going to know where the town the school is in. So watching them kind of learn about the program and teaching them how to study, you know, go and look at the stats of the girls so that you can have true information dialogues with the coaches, the practicing of the calls with each of my kids. I mean, you know, Lexi and Keely were both great examples of that, but Lexi even more so because, you know, she went through a process where she was talking to 4 or 5, you know, coaches every week, and every single call, not once did we not, you know, sit down and practice dialogue, you know, where I would act like I was the coach. I'm going to ask you questions and you ask me questions, and watching them grow in their communication skills was really rewarding for me, because it sets them up for life skills far beyond the recruiting process, and learning how to communicate in a world of really non-communicative kids was it's a great lesson to teach these young athletes.
Yeah, and I think you make a couple good points, and one of them being that ask that question because I think recruiting is very often seen as a drain, and as a lot of extra work. And as I talk to parents that have been through the process, they look back and they go, I actually really enjoyed the time that I got to spend with my kids, either traveling or talking about recruiting and talking about schools and things like that, going on visits. And so seeing recruiting as an opportunity, versus a job. And it is, you have to work for it. Obviously, the recruiting process is not easy. But I think, looking at it as an opportunity to build some of those relationships like you're talking about. And then at the same time, also, the growth of it, right? Like the communication skills that it takes, how they develop those over time. The very first phone call that I'm sure both your daughters had was vastly different, from the last one, not the last one, obviously, but like, maybe even a month or less down the road, it changes and they get better and all that kind of stuff. So, yeah, no, those are good points for sure. And this one might be a little bit confusing, so if I have to walk you through it, that's fine. But can you give like a summary of Keely and Lexi's timeline, and what that process was like, kind of step by step? And what I'm shooting for is, how different were their processes? Because I say this all the time, like everyone's recruiting process is different, everybody's story looks different. And so, you've got two kids that are both going to play D1 ball. And so, how were their timelines? How were they different? Potentially, I guess they could have been exactly the same. Pretty sure they weren't, but what did their timelines kind of look like?
Yeah, so they were completely different in their recruiting, timelines. And I mean, it's interesting. It's really kind of an interesting case study between the two, because physically they're similar, personalities they're a little different, but it goes to show that even two similar kids with similar gene pools can have completely separate experiences. So Keely, she got her first recruiting camp invite, if you will, after her 14th year. So from a conception standpoint, they were both relatively similar. 14 years when they kind of started. Keely didn't commit till she was, the end of her junior year, and it's interesting because she went through multiple positional changes. I mean, Keely played everything from middle blocker as a 14 to 16. She started out as a DS. And then, she transitioned to the right side and then to the left, and has kind of bounced around on either pin. So for her, we had to think, okay, how do we manage this recruiting process when she's obviously not going to be a middle blocker at a school that she wants to play at? She got sized out of that. And so we kind of had to take a step back from those early recruiting, camps and things like that, because we didn't want to showcase her as a middle for schools that she obviously wasn't going to play middle for, or it would have just hurt the recruiting process. I mean, you want to highlight athleticism, you want to highlight skill sets that they have that kind of set them apart. And so you need to identify that. You need to identify what was about them early on. But you've got to take some time too, because if that data point that one coach told me, that we'll know in the first 30 seconds whether you're athletically fit for our program, is true, then what that told me was you really only have one or two chances to kind of make an impact. And so you better be at the position in which you want to be evaluated at, because again, resources and time and money are limited for everybody. I don't care who you are. And so her recruiting was slow because she had to work into a kind of a 6 rotation player, which is where the schools wanted to see her just because of her physical skill set. And so, it was different. And then we had to figure out where she fit. We had to understand where she fit from a personality standpoint. We knew, the more that we talked about it and the older she got, the more we recognized that, she probably wasn't going to succeed in a larger school environment. So we needed to focus on kind of smaller school environments fit her desire academically and just, kind of socially for her. So, completely different. Lexi, she started receiving interest as a 14-year-old and committed as a 15-year-old. So it was a very accelerated timeline. But it's interesting, as kind of a manager of that process, as a parent, unfortunately, Keely was the learning. I had to learn, and I had the benefit of learning from Keely about what to do, what not to do, and kind of understanding that interest kind of promotes interest. And so we took a completely different path. Whereas Keely, we started looking at big schools and then kind of migrated our way down to what fit her with a smaller school. Lexi, we started with smaller schools, and we looked at things about the programs that, from schools that honestly she didn't have a clue who they were, where they were, if they had a volleyball team, but I did. And so we said, okay, well, what makes sense? We like tradition. We like to win. Winning's more fun than not winning. And so we started looking at schools and programs that fit us as a family and fit Lexi from a personality perspective. And then, we tried to highlight attributes that she had that we knew schools wanted. And so completely different process. Keely started with positional changes that took time. Lexi, we had to build and generate steam from a recruiting process based on kind of her athletic attributes that she had that set her apart as a 14-year-old. And so, it was interesting to watch the two. And as a parent, you learn, I got better at understanding the game with Lexi than I did with Keely. And there's a lot that I wish I would have known, early on with Keely, but you don't know what you don't know. And that's why this is so important for parents to understand.
Yeah. What, and you touched on it a little bit. What were some of the things, because you talked about Keely, kind of growing and figuring out what she was looking for as she got older and was like going through the process. What were some key moments to where, I don't like this part of this school and I don't like this part of this school. And so what were some events that happened that kind of helped guide you guys to figuring out what was going to be a good fit for Keely?
Yeah. So, when you really sit down and you talk to Keely, everybody likes the concept of going to a big school that has, appeal to it nationally. But when we started talking to Keely, we were like, well, listen, that school is a 14-hour drive. Are you willing to go to a school 14 hours away? And when she really sat down and thought about it, she made the determination in her mind, she much preferred staying at a school that was closer to home, that she had access to kind of the comforts of home in the event that she wanted to be able to come home, in a reasonable amount of time.
Yeah.
She wanted to focus on, she understood by the time she was a junior, she knew that she wanted to go into medicine. And so, we wanted to narrow down the focus of schools that, kind of had degree programs that fit. And so, she wants to be a nurse. Well, there's not a lot of schools that will work with student athletes to go through clinicals, to go through, through nursing. And so to let them even go through, the nursing program. And so once you actually start understanding that, then you can start kind of narrowing down your field of schools that make sense for you, both athletically and academically. And so, that's why McNeese was such an attractive option for her, is because, that school is focused on their nursing student and their nursing program, and their athletic departments, cater towards that desire, because they're attracting kids that have that kind of same degree plan and path. And that's kind of why McNeese made really good sense for her. And it's, it's relatively close to home. And so it was that's kind of why, she ended up at McNeese, frankly. And it's a great school for her. Great fit.
Good. Yeah, and I think that's no, I think that's all good. And with reference to like finding the good fit and really figuring out what what your daughter is looking for as far as um, checking boxes for the school, right? And everyone would love to go to a Texas or a Baylor or an A&M. Like obviously those schools have a lot of appeal, but like you said, when you really look at what you actually want, I think sometimes there's always priorities, right? And ranking when it comes to checking certain boxes. And as you kind of start to go through the process, you start to figure out that some things are more going to be more important than others. And the shiny becomes less important as you kind of go through the process, which I think is a really good point. So those are all the questions I had. Do you have anything else you want to throw out there and add?
Yeah, I mean, the thing that the key takeaway that I would, if I could make recommendations to other parents because I've been through it, is really take the time to self-evaluate. Evaluate your kids. Have an honest assessment of your kids. I have no idea how many 5'10" outsides there are playing volleyball, but there's 20,000 of them if there's one. And so, understand that you got to understand that your kid may be awesome, but in the scheme of totality, schools are looking to narrow their field, not expand it. And so really have a good self-assessment of who your kids are and, seek good advice, not just showering praise on, because it's the thing we all want to do for our kids. Secondly is, once you have that assessment, try not to waste your time on fishing for the whale every single time, because the likelihood is you're not going to catch it. And so focus on schools that make sense and then build from that. Don't pass opportunities for a lot of smaller good schools by focusing all of your attention on the whale, because schools only have so much time to dedicate to the athletes and their recruiting as well. And if you show no interest to those smaller schools, they will show no interest to you, and you will lose that opportunity.
Yeah. No, I think that's a really good point. And you said it earlier too, interest drives interest, right? So if you show interest in a school and you contact them and you email them and you stay in touch with them, that's going to drive interest back in you. And so I think that's a really, really good point. And I mean, missed opportunities, and hopefully, we're with doing what we're doing, hopefully we're missing fewer opportunities with athletes and parents. And because I think that is, once you a lot of times if you are to tell a school no, that you're not interested, like there's not a whole lot you can do to come back from that. And depending on where you are in the process, obviously, but I'm my experience as a college coach, like a kid tells you no and you go, okay, great. And then you move on to the next kid. Like that kid doesn't stay on your board, and you hope really hopefully that they come, turn things around and decide to pick your school. And you move on to the next kid, because you made this point too, like there's a ton of athletes out there, and depending on what school and what level and location, like there's the groupings are fairly large. And so once you kind of pass on opportunity, so to speak, that opportunity doesn't necessarily always get the chance to come back. Sometimes it does, obviously, but it's definitely not going to be guaranteed. So,
another point that I think is important, and I realize we're running a little long, but another point that I think is really important too is that, don't ever burn bridges with coaches that you're talking to, because, my cousin was a 4-year starter at Tech, and she went through multiple iterations of coaches that come and go. And, she made a good point to me early on in the process is fall in love with the school, don't fall in love with the coaches, because coaches change. And as you go through the recruiting process, you have no idea the coaches that you're talking to at school A, where they may end up when it comes time to actually commit. And so the more connections that you can make, the more positive, networking opportunities that these kids have to talk to as many coaches as they can, even if it's a school that they don't particularly want to go to. That doesn't matter, because the fact is that that coach may be at their dream school in a year from now. And, if they've built that relationship, even at a school that they don't know, that may carry to a school that they really want to go to. So I would never encourage people, to not talk to any particular school just because you have a negative bias for whatever reason, because you're building relationships with coaches. Now, again, you can't spend 5 hours a day talking to coaches, but don't just disregard opportunities when opportunities present themselves, because again, kids and most parents don't have a clue. I don't have a clue about these schools, where they are, they don't. And so don't take a laissez-faire attitude when it comes to schools that you may not be aware of.
Yeah. No, I think that's definitely a really good point. Awesome. Well, thanks, Dustin. Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jason. Have a great day.
You too.